and I am going to hand you over to Rosie. Now, when I was a very young, just a stripling of a boy, my dad sat me down and he said, Max, if you're ever hosting a community gathering, you should definitely choose to start with like a really strong, knowledgeable speaker. And at the time, I'll be honest, I didn't really know why he was giving me this advice. But now, many years later, standing here before you all with Rosie right here, I get it. So thank you, Dad, for your advice. I'm really, really happy to hand you over to incredible, very strong speaker, Rosie Sherry, everyone.
I'm so embarrassed. Yeah, so a few months back, Ollie, we were talking about what to talk about at this event, and Ollie was like, you should talk about the decade of community. I had done a few tweets about it, a Twitter space about it, and I was like, all right then, I'll do what you say. Is that the wrong way? There we go. So I'm talking about the decade of community. And a lot of what I talk about these days, when I talk about community, when I start talking about them, it's because there's something that kind of annoys me, something that's like people are saying stuff and I'm like, oh, that's not quite right. And the idea of community and thinking of community in the form of a decade, I think, is one of those things. And the reason that this has kind of come up is kind of because of COVID. Like after COVID, or before COVID, no one really cared about community. No one was talking about community. I had been doing community like back since 2006. No one really cared about it. It was just like, oh, it's nice. But all of a sudden, like COVID, and everybody's like, oh my God, COVID, and people jumping in, and then they're saying, it's the year of COVID, it's the year of community. I'm like, it's not the year of community. It can't be the year of community when community is a way of life. You can't think about a trend, whatever trend it is, but especially with community, you can't think of it as a year. It has to be long-term thinking. You have to think in terms of decades. And this is what I'd really love, like, if you take anything away from this, is like, community is a long-term investment. Community is something that we have to view with the long term, because if we view it in the term of just 1 year, we're never going to make any progress. So one term I use a lot to try to explain this is community grows at the speed of trust. Companies don't really like to hear this, but it's the truth. It's like when you're trying to build relationships, when you're talking to people, you can't force it, you can't push it. Is that these things happen one conversation at a time, one article at a time. And if we're going to build community, we need to embrace the fact that things happen slowly, but then hopefully quickly. Another aspect to kind of bear in mind is that whilst a lot of people say, well, things don't change and people don't change and businesses don't change, the reality is that they do, but they change over time. So one thing I like to kind of encourage people to do is to look back at your life, look back at your business, look back at your community in periods of time. Look back 1 year ago, look back 3 years ago, look back 5 years ago, look back 10 years ago, a decade, right? And you can see that things do actually change over time, but not if you look at them yearly, usually. And then obviously with COVID at the moment, and like the startup ecosystem, I don't know if people have been paying attention, but community has a lot of attention at the moment, a lot of money. I've literally never seen so much money going into community ideas at the moment. Some people don't realize how much money is going into it, but when you've lived community pre-COVID and you live it now, you're almost like, what the fuck, right? So that's my rainbow poop emoji. There's a shit ton of attention on community, and it's great. I think it's great. I'm personally I'm trying to embrace it as much as I can, but at the same time, I'm trying to kind of balance it out with the hype. Is that I'm trying to say, yes, it's great. Yes, I'm going to embrace it as much as I can and do as much as I can with this, but I'm not going to let people ruin it for me and ruin it for the future of community. And I think that's a risk that we run at the moment, that if we're not careful with what we do with our communities, we're going to end up doing things wrong, and then people are going to say in 3-5 years' time, community doesn't work. And that's my motivation when I think about community at the moment, is stop the hype, let's do it right, and let's show that community has always kind of been the way to do things in the world. It's always been the way to build business. And I would even argue that like the whole growth angle, the whole sales angle, they've been wrong all along, and they should have been focused on community from day one. Another aspect is like community is changing. Like COVID has changed everything. It's like we can't go back to what it was 2 years ago. The tech is changing. I think there's a lot of interesting tech coming into the world at the moment. It still doesn't feel good enough, in my opinion, but I think there's a lot of possibility of what we could do with tech if we give it the time. But it needs a decade to get there. I was working at Orbit before. You kind of start to see the insides of how tech companies work, and it's hard to get good technology off the ground. It's gonna take a long time, and companies have these ideas, but like I think like the successful products will end up looking really different as the years go on and as they learn about what actually is community. So, if I'm going to talk about the future of the decade of community, I kind of have to predict the future. So this is like my Rosie's radical readings of the future. And as everything with everything that I do, take it with a pinch of salt. But I also speak from experience of kind of running Ministry of Testing, which was a community of practice. And funnily enough, that took about a decade of effort to like bring real change. I'm going to go through a few ideas of how I think the community industry is going to change and the things that we could be looking out for as we go along. And the first one up is a decade of roles. So like pre-COVID, the only role or the main role that people tended to advertise for was a community manager, and that was like it. Or if you're lucky, you have a head of community role. And I think like one of the good things that's come out of the hype is that people are exploring new kinds of roles that community people can have. And the reality is that when you run a community, I think like people have called it community manager because they actually don't realize what's involved in running a community. But if you look at all the community managers out there, they're sending emails, they're updating websites, they're writing copy, they're conversing with people, they're running events, they're doing like 100 different things, and they're just a community manager, right? It's nothing. It's just like that job there. But like the reality is like to do community well, people are now realizing that actually there's a lot of skills that you need to build community. And community people need to start to specialize. And the more we specialize, the more we hopefully get better at building our communities. So the chief community officer is one of them, like having community way at the top, like someone evangelizing for the role of community. There's not a lot of them out there at the moment, but there's definitely a handful of people kind of leading the way with that. I don't think it's always necessary, personally, but I think like if you run a community company, perhaps you should have one, or at least have a VP, someone really kind of, someone who can make decisions on behalf of the community, someone who's pushing for what the community needs to achieve. Community ops is a big one as well. It's like the operations behind a community is immense, and that's probably for me like the the part that I'm worst at is like all the little pieces that you need to kind of pull a community together. It gets complicated really quickly. And you can start out really simply with like a simple website, but as you start growing and growing, it quickly becomes overwhelming. Community growth is one that I like a lot. It's a role that I feel like I had when I was starting a community. I was like always looking for growth options, how to grow the community, what's happening, what should we be doing next. And there's not really a lot of people doing that. I've got community designers and community UX there. I've not read a lot about them, and those are the kind of areas that I think that we need to explore. It's like when people ask me, how do you design a community? I'm still like, I don't know. How do you design one? You tell me. And if we can't explain it, it becomes a real problem for our industry. If we can't talk to each other as community people, how are we supposed to communicate that to our customers or the chief community officers? As these roles start evolving and as we start talking more about what community teams can look like, we should also be seeking to refine the language that we have. This has been like a personal pet project of mine, but basically in community we haven't had words to describe the things that we do, and I think it's become like a real problem. So for the past year or so, I've been like looking everywhere at what people call things in other industries, specifically startups, because like I'm very inspired by startups. So I've come up with things like monthly recurring relationships. Instead of monthly recurring revenue, it's relationships. It's like, but what does that even mean? I'm not entirely sure, but it's just like, it's more of a mental model that like in community, we should be seeking to nurture and to nurture relationships, basically, because that's like the foundation of community. And there's basically all these terms here that I've been slowly coming up with and trying to define to have a conversation about what communities mean. And I'd love to encourage everyone, you know, this is me doing this, but I think everyone could be doing this. Everyone could be looking for opportunities to really refine the language that they're using to build communities. It's like, you know, take this as inspiration, but create your own and share them, and then we can like kind of help evolve the community industry. And I think it's like the more we do this, then the more we can have better conversations. So that if we can say something with a word, if we can communicate something with one word, how much easier is that for our jobs than trying to like explain something in a lengthy email or try to justify yourself constantly. A decade of industry change. So I mentioned earlier, I founded Ministry of Testing, which is a community for software testers. And I started that back in 2007. And I left actually in 2017, I think. It's still going, I still own it, but it's, you know, I'm not running it day to day. And I kind of see like the community industry is where the testing industry was back then. Like it had nothing going for it. It was like, there was like some conferences, but they were boring. There were some conversations, but they were boring. And that's kind of what's been happening in the community world. And my frustration has been, that's not good enough for the community industry. And I've seen that through my work with Ministry of Testing. And everything like with my work with Ministry of Testing was trying to change that bit by bit, trying to change the vibe, trying to change the conversations, trying to talk about really interesting things that matter and not the things that businesses like want you to talk about, such as going to expensive conferences or getting certified and spending a lot of money to get certified. It's like, that's not really what changes an industry. I believe like what changes the industries are gatherings like this, meetups, talking about ideas. This is where all the magic starts to happen. And obviously community as well. a decade of shedding. So, this whole talk is about shedding an idea that, like, it's the year of community. And, I only started kind of writing about community, like, a couple of years ago, or even talking about community. And at first I was like, do I really have anything to add? People are already talking about it. There's already stuff going on. I'm not sure if I've got good ideas. But the more I dived into it, the more I was like, my approach kind of became, oh, that's interesting, but I don't like that. Surely there's a better way. Why? Or if something doesn't feel quite right, I'm like, how can we do it better? Or is it actually needed? And I think we can, this is almost my mental model of kind of approaching community at the moment, is that everything that I come across, I start to question. And I start to look for reasons why it's wrong. Not because I want to disprove people, but I want to find opportunities and I want to find gaps to kind of improve the industry. And it's hard because you get pushback everywhere you go. It's like people are saying, like, but we've always done it that way, it's okay. And actually it's not okay. And the world has changed, COVID has changed everything, and we don't put up with things like we used to before. The old tactics don't work. So I'm hoping like a decade of shedding will happen where we can just say, actually, we're not going to do that. That doesn't work. I don't want to do that. It's not going to bring us results. It might help our vanity metrics. It might make us look good. But does it actually build real community? Does it bring sustainability? Probably not. So, and the non-value adds is a big one in communities. Like we feel it's like constant pressure to let's keep going, more. We've done an event, we must grow it. But it's like, I think quite often people don't really focus on what they got out of the event, or what, instead of like doing more, is like getting more value out of what you've already created. And a lot of people end up going to events and actually not getting any value or not getting any connection. And people are calling that community. So, a decade of collaboration. I think this is an interesting one. And I think this is going to take a lot of hard work from community. But like, as much as I love community, I think we also have to understand that community needs to exist as part of an organization. And we have to find ways to exist. It's like, community isn't here to be the star of the show, even though it literally is here now. That was not planned. But community is there to show that it is worthy. It's not here to be at the top. Community is here to collaborate. Community is here to connect. Community is great for finding value, for creating innovation, for understanding people and ideas and bringing that back to the business. Community is great for sales, but it doesn't mean that you're out there selling. It's great for supporting sales and bringing ideas back and challenges that people have, problems that people have. Community is great at all of this. But I think perhaps part of the problem is that a lot of communities don't communicate back to the rest of the business. They're not shouting out about the value that they're bringing. And we need to get better at that. We need to, if a customer comes in, it's the sales that takes credit, right? They're like, oh, look, new sale. But maybe as community, we should be looking at the history of that customer and saying, oh, look, they came through community. Oh, look, I've had 5 conversations with them over the course of a year or something. And that's why, that's a big reason why they became a sale, because they've come through community. That's just an example, and there's just like so much value that community can provide to the rest of the business. There's value in like supporting product and coming up with product ideas, and pains that customers are having. But to do that, we need to find ways to work with, almost create bridges to these other parts of the business. A decade of data. I think typically people call this measurement. I'm still like not sure how I feel about it, but businesses like to measure. Businesses like to collect data. Businesses like vanity metrics. I love a growth chart. I still do. I love like seeing, you know, I won't hide away from it. And I think this is a big point that we need to figure out. Like, I still feel uncomfortable measuring community and how to measure community. I'm still not sure how to do it. And like, if I'm not sure how to do it, it's like how are other people supposed to figure that out? And I just don't have great answers for this, apart from the fact that I know community works. And I know we can do better. And I know we can do better with data that we have. I know we can do better with like pulling data together to better understand everything that's going on. I do think like the tools will get better, and the tools are getting better to help us respond to people, to help us have better conversations with people, to help us just like be more effective, but not for effective sake, but it's just like at the moment, if you want to reach out and speak to a community member, it's tough to keep track of. It's tough to the idea of trying to keep that in a CRM just doesn't feel right. But there's activity happening everywhere, and I think as communities and as businesses, we need to kind of figure out better what is it that we need to track, and what is it that we can do to help the community builders on the ground do their best work. There's definitely a trend at the moment. I've felt it, where community builders are still having to prove themselves constantly that their work is valuable. And I think it's a huge problem that we have. Is like people, even though there's the hype, people still, I feel, aren't convinced of the work that we do. And we need to, not just as community people, but as businesses, we need to kind of like find a way through this. And I'm not sure it's about measurement. I think it's more about data. It's like, how can we get the data we have, and how can we tell stories around what we have? How can we show the value? How can we perhaps measure some things or one or two main things, and the rest can kind of be stories that we tell? How do we know as community people what are the important stories to tell? What do we share to other parts of the businesses? How do we create those bridges that I've kind of spoken about, and give them value? And do we keep track of the value that we give them? Do we say, oh, we've given you 10 ideas from community this month? Is that a great value add? It's those kind of things that I think are really, really important and really valuable. And it's those kind of things that marketing love to brag about. If they ever got that, they're like, oh, we got 10 responses on the survey, but like, what if we could do better in community and get 100 responses, but also get like 100 meaningful responses, or 100 responses that really kind of give the value and give the impact. So like this is like a whole area to explore over the next decade. How can we use data creatively? And I'm going to end it on a decade of belief. I know like startups are like big into the unicorns. It's like, you got to believe, or you know, they want to become a unicorn company, and a lot of it is about belief. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have as communities is how can we convince others that this is the thing, that this is important. And there are examples out there of communities that have done well, but there's also examples out there of communities that haven't done well and haven't brought the value. I believe in community. I literally believe like community is the answer to everything if we do it well. I really do. It's like anywhere you go, local communities, online communities, like communities of product, communities of practice. I think communities are the answer to education. Like, we don't need schools, we don't need universities. I wholeheartedly believe that. I grew up educating myself through community. I've seen a whole stream of people in the testing industry like advance their careers from junior to like managers and directors community. So I just believe, I wholeheartedly believe that community is the way forward. But we still have to prove it, and we still have to even create better examples. I think I think we can do better. So much we could do better. So much I wish I had 10 years ago now to do better with the community that I had back then. And I look forward to like the tools that are coming, the tech that's coming, hopefully. But to do that, we need the belief and the backing from everyone. Questions? Thank you.
Hello. Oh, mic me up, Scotty. Thanks, Paul. Everyone, that was Rosie Sherry. We're talking about shedding. I actually shedded one of my responsibilities. I should have hyped up your CV better because it is a beast of a CV. So I'm going to quickly do it laterally now, if that's okay, with everyone. So just from my lovely iPad here, Rosie Sherry, she's a community builder. She's previously led Indie Hackers and Orbit, Indie Hacker, and founder as well. So just have achieved a great deal. And Rosie, I have for you here a bumper crop of lovely questions. So I think maybe a good place to start, given that you were mentioning sort of that you were excited about some of the tech opportunities, is what do you think could be better about the tech that we have now, which we're using to run communities? And is there any particular examples that you find yourself really drawn towards?
The tech is really messy at the moment. It's a real kind of pain. And I know like tech, like there's a habit of tech of like unbundling and bundling kind of thing. But like if I want to just like message people or email a few people in my community, it's hard. I have to like, if it's just like a small group of people, I have to kind of manually grab their data. It can vary from tool to tool. But yeah, I guess like the tech is like, I hope it kind of bundles up again to some extent. I'm not sure if I've got good answers. For me, I just want the tech to make our jobs easier.
Yeah.
If we think of community builders day to day, I want to go in and have conversations. I want to go in and help people. At the moment, it's really hard to do that. You're like here, you're there, your email. It's just, it feels too hard.
Thank you. When should a company hire its first community role? Or what are the warning signs that you've missed the proverbial boat and now you're in the water?
I think community should be one of the first hires, personally. I've seen a trend towards this actually. More and more startups are like having a community hires like the first 3 people. I would love to see more of that. I think that's the way to go, and to really take community to heart and build community into everything they do.
I mean, I'm biased, but here. I'm going to read this question out verbatim because it's beautifully written. Not to say the others aren't, folks. Thanks for your context and concepts, Rosie. That's such a strength of yours. Thank you. Compliments are nice, everyone. What's the most damaging mistake that you're seeing in the industry, asterisk, that is not being talked about enough, asterisk, question mark?
People aren't doing community well. People are getting sick of joining communities. I've seen these comments quite a few times recently. They join communities and they never go back. There's nothing there for them. And people think that that's what community is. And this is what I kind of talk about, is that we have to be careful. We have to like protect what community means. And at the moment, a lot of people are jumping into community without really knowing what they're jumping into. So that's the risk. People jump into, I want a tool for a community instead of I want to have conversations. And every time people say, what tool should I use for community? I'm like, well, you haven't had the conversations, because if you had had the conversations, you would know what tool to use. So the conversations feed into the tools that you should use. And that has like a knock-on effect, because you don't know what tool to use and you're jumping into using a tool, then you create an experience that isn't actually very respectful to the members that are joining. I like to have a philosophy of like not wasting anybody's time. And I think a lot of communities are wasting people's time, and we shouldn't do that as a culture. We shouldn't waste people's time.
Thank you so much. Kind of, I don't know, maybe this is a tenuous link. I'll let you decide. But I think it's a really interesting question to kind of take the shoe and put it on the other foot, so to speak. Someone's asked, as a community member, what's the kind of level of contribution that you should give to strengthen your connections and kind of give yourself influence, I suppose?
Yeah, it depends what you want. I think everybody goes into community with different goals. Some people try to keep community members around forever, but I don't think you should try to do that. I think it's more considering like people have come to do something and to benefit from something, or to give something. Some people are coming at like the early stage of their career, and they need to learn a lot and they need to lurk a lot before that they can actually contribute. Others are at like the latter stage of their career, so they want to contribute a lot and give back or build up their reputation. It's hard, and that's another hard thing about community, I think, is that you have to design for all these people. But yet that's a community manager's job. It's easy just to do like 100 different things, right? It's like,
I have a question for you it's literally steaming. It's so hot off the presses. It's just come right at us. But I think it's a really interesting one. What are some of the common mistakes that you see? Say folk have gone ahead and for one of the first hires as a community manager, what are some of the mistakes that you see those companies walking into when they're trying to build those community spaces at that early stage?
Trying to go too big too fast. Trying to value the vanity metrics, and expecting things to happen overnight. I think people see the successful communities and they're like, oh, I want that. Yeah, if they look under the hood, it's like taking 5 or 10 years to actually get there. I think that's a big problem.
Would you say, as someone who's led different communities, are they much of a muchness? Do you feel like you can take all your learnings from leading one community and just merge into a whole new community, or do you feel like what the community is built around is going to have a big impact on how you as a community manager approach that role?
Sorry, say that again?
So if you're sort of taking over a community, do you feel like one community is very much like another to be a manager for, or do you feel like each one is a very specific case?
I think there's similarities, but I think the challenge with community is like trying to understand your people. This is actually a big thing, is like when community managers or builders, whatever you want to call them, when they leave a community, it leaves a big hole. Because they've spent however much time they've been spending building up this community. They have all these relationships. And I think businesses kind of underestimate like how much of an impact that can actually make. There was definitely an impact, for example, when I left Indie Hackers. There was just like this hole afterwards that they didn't quite fill in. But there's also a hole for the community builders. Like they've spent, I think companies need to be more respectful for the community builders, because they've spent however much time in that community building up real relationships, and if they cut them off, quite often like businesses like cut off their employees quite harshly or quickly, or they lose access to certain things. But like when community people have been building up relationships and that gets cut off from them, it's a huge like emotional thing to like leave a community as a community builder. And I don't think anyone really talks about that. It was definitely hard for me, like leaving Indie Hackers, leaving Orbit, leaving Ministry of Testing even. It was, emotionally, it was just like, oh my God, you know, I have to move on.
Thank you so much for your candor. There's so many good questions. I feel like I'm in a patisserie and I have to pick. But we have time for one more. How do you feel about the idea that people found their tribes online during COVID? And what do you think that means for sort of physical IRL communities?
I'd love people to meet up in real life, to, you know, go places together, to meet up wherever makes sense, to book you know, create mini retreats. I'd love to see like lots of that happening. I'd love for people just to travel down and see each other that they've been in contact all this time. I'm personally trying to just like randomly invite people I've met over COVID or over the past few years, and just like invite them over to stay, because like I feel like I know them. We've been like chatting all this time, and I think it's like a nice way to ease back in, is like to like events are gonna be tough for a while. I think events have to be different, and I think we can probably like remake the rules to some extent of what we can do and what's valuable to us. I think the idea of going to really big events is at least for me, is just like not appealing.
Wonderful. Everyone, if we could have another huge hand for Rosie Sherry.